Chapter 4. The Ruinous Purge. I could no longer deny the hard fact that my past, in more ways than I wished to count, was catching up with me. My entire life, in one way or another, had always been based on stringent safeguards. But after my latest incident, along with the weight of my divorce, the pillars of my foundation were beginning to crumble. Days after my recurring illness, when I was working outside, I could still make out the washed outline on the gray cement. Even though it was barely visible, and I felt certain that no one else would ever notice, I knew what was once there was and what it represented. Just contemplating the mere thought of losing so much in such a short period of time incensed me. But before my anger could build any further, I glanced at the dark green cascading vines and the bright orange and purple impatiens flowers. They flushed away my anxiety. For the most part, whenever I reached critical mass at the heart of everything, I always realized that I was extremely lucky. From the moment when I first opened my eyes, every morning on the end of the day, to the end of the day, no matter how grueling or hectic, I knew how fortunate I was to simply be alive. In foster care, I once became sick in front of the entire student body in the junior high cafeteria. After that, I learned that because Mother had me swallow ammonia twice in a 24-hour period, I was lucky to be able to breathe, let alone swallow food. Later, when a doctor tried to explain to me, a wide-eyed boy with hypersonic thought process, I listened, but was dismissive about my condition's possible long-term effects. As a young teenager, I didn't allow the pertinent information to seep in. Just as I had always internally programmed myself to deal with the shame and guilt from my past, I simply covered up my problem. I adjusted. I hid in plain sight. I stayed away from particular foods. I learned to eat in certain ways. My bites were smaller, and I chewed more quickly. But once, after years of continuing to deny my problem, I was becoming honored with an award at an elaborate dinner ceremony, and my insecurity nearly triggered another incident. Terrified and embarrassed, I floundered to maintain control. I eventually recovered with no one the wiser, but from then on, I adjusted by avoiding eating in public settings. Like many times in my past, I built a labyrinth of cocoons to ensure my protective isolation. After a few years, and with constant practice, I pushed aside my reality and even bought into my own deception. Because my incidents were rare, 2, maybe 3 times a year, I attributed them to too much work, extensive traveling, or lack of rest. At home, when my body fought to recover, my justifications branched out to include the wrong foods, too much coffee, my love of cooking thick tomato sauce with freshly pressed garlic, and even my occasional cigar. I didn't want to accept my past as a problem, and if it came up, I would deal with it by simply pushing through. But that was then, seemingly a different lifetime ago. The day Marcia fled, I was on the road. That evening, not knowing of my wife's early departure, my numbed mind spun out different scenarios of the certain drama of facing Marcia before she flew off. Late in the evening, exhausted, I finally fell into a fitful sleep. It seemed the moment I could feel myself float away, I started myself awake with violent hiccups. I didn't even have the time to flee to the bathroom. I threw up on myself and the hotel bed. After trying to clean the sheets by washing them in the shower, I spent the remainder of the night contemplating the fact that if I had not awoken myself, I could have choked on my own vomit. But once my fear faded, My pattern of dismissal went with it. I had the gall to believe that when my wife flew off, my stress triggers would flee with her. Now, in the late afternoon, after plucking off dead flowers, I once again got down on my hands and knees and struggled to scour away any remaining traces of my bile. Later that evening, still unable to sleep, I found myself massaging my throat. Without fail, even decades after the incident, I connected to the immense sickness of my perpetrator. The first time Mother had me swallow the ammonia, I had no idea of its possible effects, even as she made a dramatic demonstration of preparing my latest form of punishment. I truly had very little concern over its outcome. Since it was late at night and I had been refused food, I was tired and too worn out to analyze the magnitude of my situation. The very next afternoon, Mother showed off to Father with a repeat performance. As I backed into my father's detached frame as a form of protection, I was fighting to keep my mouth shut to avoid a single drop. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't run off. I never stood up for myself, not even by proclaiming the simplest of commands, no, stop. In other words, I swallowed whatever my perpetrator dished out. After ingesting the cleaner, like the night prior, the inside of my throat suddenly felt as if it were on fire. At the same time, my trachea closed off. Unable to throw in a single molecule of air, I collapsed directly in front of my father's feet. I used both of my tiny red fists to pound the multicolored spotted floor with a desperate hope this somehow would permit me to breathe. But it didn't. With every wretched second, I felt myself slipping away. Then, in pure molten rage, with all the strength I had left, I looked up at my father's statue-like body. From the deepest part of my being, I screeched at Mother, Father, and then myself. The very next second, Mother bent down to slap me on my upper back, which finally permitted me to breathe. Still on my knees, I gulped in as much air as possible. With my strained vision beginning to clear, I glanced up at both parents. I had known and accepted just how sinister and sick Mother was the day she burned my arm on the gas stove. And with every escalating situation, I saw and felt how broken and disconnected my father had become. Out of the three of us in that closed setting, I felt I was the only person who was actually sane. I wasn't mentally ill or detached, in part from alcohol. I had a razor-sharp mind and the hidden power of raw determination, but I lacked the courage to prevent the obvious. As an adult, in the solitude of my private setting, the price I still pay for my inaction as a child is not only the swirl of frustrating emotions, but the increasing anxiety of being too afraid to simply breathe.